Many of you have heard me say this before. One of my greatest teachers, he would often say sermons are sometimes written, but it doesn't matter whether they are or not. They're never complete. They're just given at some point. And so today is one of those messages that I've been struggling to work on this entire week, and I couldn't actually write it. So I hope that God has a word in here for you, as God has a word in this for me and for everybody. You may not know this. The way that we choose which stories we tell on which Sunday is according to something called the lectionary. And this year we made the choice to start using what's called the narrative lectionary. It's an online resource that the whole idea is that if you start coming to church after Labor Day and you were to attend all throughout the fall, you would hear all the big important stories of the Old Testament, so that by the time we start talking about Jesus at Advent, you start to see the pattern between the Jewish faith that then led into Jesus's life and ministry, and it's where we all come from. It's how we get familiar with our story. We are a people of story. And just so you know, our Sunday school class this year is learning all the same stories we are every single Sunday. All the same Old Testament stories every single Sunday. So it's one way that we're trying to make it easier for people who are in here on a Sunday morning to talk to the kids over there on a Sunday morning. You're all sharing in the same story, same experience, but hopefully they're learning their age-appropriate lessons from these stories. It's kind of misleading. The story itself is called The Parting of the Red Sea. You heard that one? Okay, the reason why I say it's misleading is because it's named for the big, huge, amazing event that goes on in this story, but that's not actually the point of the story. So today we're going to tell the story in a slightly different way so that we can start to hear this really familiar story and actually get the point of it. Because this story isn't just about God doing something amazing or something unbelievable. This story is actually about you and me. This is a story for anyone who has felt trapped between right and wrong and not knowing where to turn. This is a story for anyone who has believed really passionately about something and then had a change of heart. This is a story for anyone who has been made to feel scared, afraid, or panicked. Anyone who has felt like they didn't have power over their own lives. Anyone who has felt they had nowhere to turn when something terrible was happening to them. This story is for you. So, lights up on the Red Sea. Gathered around the Red Sea are the formerly known as the Hebrew people, now known as the Israelite army. That's what it says in the story in Exodus. They are the Israelite army. But they're not any kind of army that you've ever seen. They don't have weapons. They don't have armor. They actually have next to nothing because they have just fled from Egypt. They've been freed, and they fled from the slavery of Egypt into the wilderness, and they didn't get a chance to take anything with them. The story actually tells us that they didn't have time for their bread to rise. They have unleavened bread with them. They had no time to grab anything. They just went. So it's this huge gathering, all the people of Israel gathered together, marching out of Egypt into freedom, into the wilderness. And they come to the Red Sea. And the way the land was set up, there was no way of going around it, and it was far too wide and far too deep to go through. So having no idea what to do next, the Israelite army stayed by the side of the Red Sea, and they decided to set up camp, and they would figure out what to do next from there. And that's when all pandemonium broke loose. Because what had happened is Pharaoh had a change of heart. God had sent Moses and 10 plagues in order to encourage Pharaoh to release these people, set them free. And Pharaoh had a change of heart. What it says in the story is that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And Pharaoh decided, no, I shouldn't have set those people free. I'm going to send my fastest chariots and my biggest army to go out and bring them back to Egypt or have them killed in the process. And so as the chariots went storming across the land, as dust rose in the air, as cheers were going out from Egypt, the Israelites were cowering by the side of the Red Sea, knowing that doom awaited them, knowing that certain death was just marching towards them, ready to have them wiped off the face of the planet. And panic set in. They were out of their minds. They started saying things that didn't make any sense. There was actually one person who said to Moses, what, did they run out of graves in Egypt? You had to bring us all the way out here to die? We should have stayed there, living as slaves, rather than die in the wilderness. What were you thinking? They were going nuts. Pause. Freeze frame. Now, we don't know where or how or even if this story really happened. But we do know that it's a story involving human beings. And what's really important for us to understand is that human beings then are the same as human beings now. So at the risk of saying too much on a topic I don't know enough about, I want to tell you a few things about panic in the human body. When we are stressed, when we are anxious, when we start perceiving danger, adrenaline rushes through our bloodstream, and it speeds up our breathing, and it speeds up our blood, and it gets our muscles ready for action, ready to exert themselves. That's what adrenaline does. It has this effect to get us to flee or fight, to be ready to take action and stop the thing that is coming towards us, right? Okay, so there's adrenaline coursing through your body when you're panicked. And also, part of that adrenaline is something known as cortisol. And I learned a few years ago that cortisol is the hormone that is released when you experience fear. And cortisol has the effect of taking away your brain's thinking power. We have these amazing computers in our heads, and cortisol, when we experience fear or too much anxiety, it actually floods our brain and turns our brilliant thinking minds into just fear sponges, and we lose the ability to regulate our thinking, we lose the ability to regulate our emotions, and we are just full-on chaos in our own brains. That's what happens to every human being when we experience fear, danger, panic, anxiety, stress. We are not the first people to panic. We are not the first people to lose our minds because we don't know how to act and we don't know what to do. We may, however, be the first generation of people who have that experience nearly all day, every day. Because we have a 24/7 mass media culture that gives us plenty of reason to feel that way all day, every day. We're the first generation to live with this perpetually. So we can learn something from this story. So back to the story. Everybody's just got their brains taken away, and they're just fear sponges in their head. They're running around, they're saying, Moses, you should just let us die in Egypt. Ah, they're going nuts. And Moses says to them, what I'm going to read to you now from Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 through 14. Moses says to them, fear not. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be still. Fear not, stand firm. For the Egyptians whom you see today and shall never see again, the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be still. Something we need to name about the reality of these Israelite people in that moment. They only knew themselves transactionally. At that moment, they only had a sense of who they are because they lived their entire lives in a transactional relationship with their oppressors. When we say transaction, we mean an exchange of gifts and goods and services, right? So as slaves, the deal was this. The transaction was, you work for us all the time. You allow us to use your bodies any way we want, and in return, we will not kill you. So no wonder they're panicked at the side of the Red Sea, because they have decided to be free. They've decided to not uphold their end of the transaction, which means that now death is coming. They're no longer serving their purpose, so now they'll be destroyed. The invitation to be still is an invitation to transform. The invitation to be still is an invitation to see ourselves not as transactional people, but as relational human beings, as part of a wider network of creation that isn't here to work for us. It isn't here for us to exert our power over it. We are all in this together. When we are transformed into bearers of the light, bearers of God's presence in this world, we transform this world from one of transaction into one of light and life, justice and love, where we are giving and receiving rather than buying and selling. That's the choice the Israelites had to make that day. Do we see ourselves as only property, in which case our panic is telling us to either flee, which we can't do, or fight, which will surely destroy us? We don't know what to do. The invitation to be still is an invitation to trust in God, to invest ourselves in God's way of being in the universe as God built it, to not worry about taking matters into our own hands, but to just let things play out the way God will play them out, which is always pointed towards justice and life and freedom and love for all people. So then God blew a strong wind and the sea parted, and they walked across and then crashed down. Like I said, not the important part of the story. But abstract stories like that, it's not an abstract story, it's a very specific story, but stories in which God the Almighty is doing big acts like that, it can be really hard to understand how that translates into human life. So thank God for Jesus, truly. Because Jesus was brought to earth specifically to show us what these big stories, what these big spiritual lessons look like in the context of human relationship. So in the Gospel of John, we're given this story. There was a day when a large group of religious leaders, and remember the time and place, large group of religious leaders, all of them men, all of them. Large group of religious leaders come before Jesus with their hands full of stones and a woman among them, and they say, Jesus, this woman broke the law, she committed adultery, the law says we have to stone her to death. What do you say? And they handed Jesus a rock. Jesus didn't say anything at first. Then he put the rock down, and he started drawing in the sand. He started drawing with his finger in the sand. And this army of men around him were saying, hey, what do you say? What should we do? Jesus, tell us the answer. Come on, we know the law. We're ready to act. We found the woman. We're going to stone her to death. What do you think we should do? Are you going to get in on this or not? Come on, make a decision. Choose a side. Pick a side. Let's do this. Let's do this now. Come on. And Jesus said nothing. He continued to draw in the sand. He was completely still. And after several moments of stillness, Jesus simply said to them, let the first one among you who is without sin cast the first stone. And each man took a turn, dropping a rock, stepping aside, walking away. And they left the woman in the safekeeping of Jesus. God wants nothing more than for us to love each other. God wants nothing more than for us to have a society built around kindness and justice for all people. And because we are transactional thinkers, we often think that it's totally up to us to make justice and love and kindness happen every single day. And when we see people doing things and treating people in ways that are against the project of love and justice and freedom for all people, we panic. Friends, do not panic. Do not fear. For the Lord will fight for you, and all you need to do is be still. God wants nothing more than for us to love each other. And sometimes we just don't know how to do that. But we can choose to not do anything rather than doing the wrong thing. Stillness, silence, it's not passive. It's not nothing. It's an active choice. Our own brains and bodies are wired to act, to take control, to command all the time. When you make the conscious choice to be still, to trust that God will act in this place, that's not passive. That is extremely active. That is making the firm decision to breathe before we speak. To sit still long enough so that our hormones can run their course and not drive us to do something we will regret later. When we are pressured to make decisions now, to choose sides immediately, to add to the chaos and noise, we run the risk of hurting one another deeply. Sometimes hurting one another in ways that cannot be healed, that cannot be made better. God is always on the side of love and life, freedom and justice. For all people. Always. We may not always know how to act to help bring that reality into this world. But when you're not sure about what is right and what is wrong, God invites us to be still. Each and every person in this room is a powerful person. You are citizens of the most prosperous, most powerful country in the history of the world. You are consumers in a capitalist society, and you have 100% control over where your money goes, how it gets spent, what it gets invested in. You are God's beloved people. You're given the power to bless others as you have been blessed, and you've also been given the power to rest, to practice Sabbath, to take care of yourself, and allow God to do the heavy lifting. We all have the ability to choose how our power will be used. And when in doubt, I invite you, friends, be still and be transformed.